listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, this week, Defence Minister Richard Marles and our Foreign Minister Penny Wong met with their US counterparts in Washington for AUSMIN. We break down what this latest agreement means, what it has to do with China and Taiwan, and how we are gearing up for the greatest uncertainty in the Indo-Pacific since World War II. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Wednesday, the 10th of December. A 36-year-old man has been arrested in Sydney southwest after a woman was allegedly assaulted and then ran over in what police describe as an horrendous domestic violence attack. The woman suffered critical injuries and is now fighting for life in hospital. Here is Detective Chief Inspector Paul Aubrey.
When the police arrived on scene, I met with a pretty horrendous sort of scene where a woman has suffered serious injuries. There were 3 children inside the home at the time of the incident, ranging in age from 15 to 6 at the time. Those children were unharmed.
The man, who is known to police, allegedly fled the scene before later being apprehended. The Federal Coalition is preparing a hardline immigration policy as opposition leader Susan Lee moves to counter a major swing to one nation. Under the draft plan, people living unlawfully in Australia would be prioritised for deportation, and breaching the Australian values statement could trigger visa cancellations. The Coalition says it wants faster asylum assessments and a tougher approach to undocumented migrants. But critics warn the plan risks echoing US President Donald Trump's style deportation policy and could be extremely costly to implement. The policy is still being finalised and will go to shadow cabinet. And a 68-million-year-old dinosaur fossil is going under the hammer in London, with experts saying it could fetch around $10 million. Nicknamed Spike, the rare dinosaur skeleton comprises of around 100 fossil bones and is in astonishing condition. Some even believe it may be a new species. Now it's time to get into our deep dive on this week's AUSMIN meeting between the US and Australia's top defence chiefs. Security and defence expert Jennifer Parker joins us to explain why this latest announcement is a major win for Australia, but also warns as concerns grow over China and its influence in the Indo-Pacific, the threat of a conflict on our doorstep is growing increasingly likely. Jen, thanks so much for joining us. This important AUSMIN meeting in Washington this week between the US and, of course, Australia. Do you think Australia walked away as winners from this?
I think this was a win for Australia. I mean, if you cast back, obviously we're in December now, if you cast back throughout the year and the ups and downs of the Australia-US relationship, at least in the media anyway, and the will we, won't we have a meeting between Albanese and Trump, is AUKUS cancelled, all of that pressure. And then around May this year, when the US came out and said we should be spending more on defence. If you think about this AUSMIN meeting, we've walked away with further enhancing the force posture initiatives, that is the US forces rotating through Australia, agreement to build more US-designed weapons in Australia under co-production, which is so very beneficial to us in terms of resilience. And of course, the full steam ahead on AUKUS commentary from the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defence in the US. I think all of those is a really positive way for Australia to wrap up the year. And you've got to remember, this AUSMIN talk, so the 35th AUSMIN, actually came on the back of the US National Security Strategy being released last week. In that National Security Strategy, there was a key line that talked about the fact that Australia needs to do more on defence spending. So I thought this dynamic could have been setting up to really pressure our Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, but actually they all walked away looking like good friends who were aligned on their view of the Indo-Pacific and the relationship and the alliance. So I would put this down as a win.
We'll unpack the details in this meeting in just a moment, Jen, but just to your point there about this turnaround in diplomacy, because we have seen quite a rollercoaster relationship with Australia and the US, especially over the last 12 months. What do you think is behind this turnaround? Do you think international developments, especially with Taiwan and China, basically America has said possibly we need Australia and we need to make sure we're on the same path?
Look, I think that it's true to say that in terms of the Indo-Pacific, if the US wants to stay relevant in the Indo-Pacific and achieve deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, which is part of their stated strategy, deterrence against China, then Australia is crucial to them. I mean, our geography is absolutely critical to US operations. So we have that in, excuse the pun, as a kind of a trump card that we can always play. But I think that it's very clear the Australian government has been able to demonstrate to the US that we have been doing a lot on defence. Now, in my personal opinion, I think we should be doing much more. I think we need to be spending more. We need to be accelerating things. But I think with the AUKUS agreement, I think with the critical minerals deal, which is part of, wider national security and economic security, I think with things like the force posture initiatives and our support to them, so there's the rotation of US forces through Australia, and some of our broader, I guess, diplomatic statements supporting the US. So we actually came out very forcefully eventually and supported the US strikes on Iran. I think those things have shown to the US that we are still a very reliable and a very strong ally. So I think that all of those things have kind of showed a bit of good grand strategy, I guess, from Australia's perspective to win over that relationship.
There has been some commentary that with this rotation of US forces and the increase in the US presence here in Australia, that this is the biggest military presence in Australia since the end of the Second World War. Is that a correct analysis?
Yeah, look, that is largely correct. Now, I don't have the specific numbers in front of me, but it is true. So ever since Prime Minister Gillard at the time, around 2012, agreed to rotate US Marines through Darwin, we've been seeing increasing rotations, so increasing numbers of US Marines. We've also then had initiatives announced like the Enhanced Air Cooperation Initiative, with focused a lot in these AUSMIN talks, which is about bomber force rotation, so US bomber force rotations through our northern air bases. We've also had Submarine Rotation Force West, which is the agreement under Phase 1 of AUKUS, which will see from 2027 a squadron of US submarines and probably about 1,000, 1,200 US sailors based out of Rockingham. So all of those initiatives, there are more coupled together. This certainly would be the largest US footprint in Australia since the end of World War II. And really, when you think about the way we describe our strategic circumstances, bipartisan support, government and opposition say the most challenging strategic circumstance since World War II, that kind of makes sense.
Jen, in regards to what new details or agreements have come out of this AUSMIN meeting, can we unpack the details there? What's new?
So it's important to know that AUSMIN doesn't just focus on defence, it does focus on foreign policy as well. And that's why we have our Foreign Minister and our Defence Minister or Deputy Prime Minister who attend. So there is a lot about joint work in the economic space on infrastructure in the region and working with countries like Japan and Papua New Guinea, subsea cable resilience initiatives, those sort of things. I guess the meat of it, though, is really the focus on the defence aspects. And there's probably three key elements of that have come out of this joint statement. One is the re-emphasis on those force posture initiatives I mentioned before, and it really does flag the enhanced air cooperation, which has generally been the bomber force rotations through our northern air bases and the work between Australia and the US, including US investment to improve the capabilities of those air bases. In this statement, we saw it talking about also fighter aircraft, a US fighter aircraft likely rotating through those bases, and intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance aircraft. So I think that is a growth in the types of aircraft and probably the footprint of the US Air Force that we're going to see rotating through those bases. I think a second element is there is the commitment to establish a US Force Posture Initiative Oversight Committee. I don't think it's quite called that in the statement, but effectively it is a committee that I'm assuming is between our Department of Defence bureaucrats and the Pentagon, who are monitoring exactly what is happening under these force posture initiatives to make sure that we are both aligned. I think that's largely positive. The second element is the focus on guided weapons, explosive ordnance. So we know the Australian government has been focusing on our guided weapons, explosive ordnance enterprise, and that is the ability to build and co-produce guided weapons in Australia, because in the event of a crisis or conflict, we're not going to be able to buy weapons from the US. They're not going to make it across the Pacific. And we've seen from whether it's the quagmire in the Middle East or the Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, that guided weapons, so missiles and guided rockets, are critical to modern warfare. So that was a real focus. There was some new stuff in there about different types of missiles we're going to be working on, including and significantly hypersonic missiles, so co-production, co-sustainment. So I think that's really positive for Australia. And I think the third element, and to be expected, was really the emphasis on AUKUS during AUSMIN. Now, we know that the US AUKUS review is complete. We know the Australian government has it. We don't have the details, but we know that from President Trump's comments in October and the comments from Secretary of State of the US and Secretary of War of the US at AUSMIN that it is full steam ahead, which is a wonderful, I guess, naval analogy when you think about it. So there's a lot of focus on the importance of critical timelines for AUKUS, and I think really around the Submarine Rotation Force West, which is the US squadron that's meant to rotate, a squadron of 4 Virginia-class submarines rotate out of HMS Sterling, south of Rockingham, from 2027. So those were kind of the key emphasis in AUSMIN in the defence space.
Jen, in regards to looking at this, stepping back from a bigger point of view, the increased US military presence, we're talking about hypersonic missiles. You would think straight away, okay, that is so we can launch missiles, whether that's Australia or the US, from Australia to hit specific targets, whether that be in China or in the Indo-Pacific. Surely this is all pointing to the fact that, along with our alliance with the US, we are preparing for an imminent conflict. Would that be fair?
Look, I'd say we are preparing for the increased likelihood of conflict. I wouldn't say imminent. I mean, I think, we've learned through strategic history, anyone that predicts the next conflict is a bit of a fool. But the dynamics in the world in terms of the breakdown of the multilateral system, the increased use of force from countries, whether it's Russia's illegal invasion, what's happening in the Middle East, China's aggression in this region, that the chances of a conflict are likely. And I think that the step up in the alliance, the relationship, and the weapons capabilities we're working on is reflective of that. Now, these hypersonic missiles that are mentioned in the AUSMIN talks, they are hypersonic missiles called the Hypersonic Attack Cruise Missile. They're actually launched from aircraft, so probably will be launched from our F-35 once they're developed. They don't have the ranges to kind of, hit China from Australia or something like that, but they do allow us to protect ourselves from, task groups in the event of a conflict that might be operating in vicinity of Australia. So I guess what would I take away from it? Look, this is clearly preparations and strengthening the alliance for an uncertain world. And I think that's something the Australian public really needs to grapple with and what that means for our daily lives as we move forward.
Jen, speculation is also increasing of a possible invasion by China of Taiwan. There's ongoing speculation about that, and that will change all the dynamics, as we very well know, in the Indo-Pacific. What's the likelihood of that happening, and where does that leave the US, but also us as Australia, because we are a key partner or we have a key alliance with the US?
Well, look, this is the big question, isn't it? Look, China has been very clear that they see Taiwan as an inalienable part of China. Not the entire world agrees with them. Australia doesn't have that policy at all, but China is clear on that. Now, there are a number of ways that China can seek to reunify Taiwan. Of course, by Taiwan agreeing to it. Another one is by force. Increasingly, I think it's clear in the political domain in Taiwan that Taiwanese population are not about to agree to peacefully rejoin China. So what this means is that there is increasing likelihood of China taking some sort of military action. Now, there's lots of hypotheticals about how that could be. On the one hand, people talk about it potentially being a naval blockade, so stopping goods, key fuel, energy resources going in to Taiwan by sea. The other that people talk about is a potential invasion of Taiwan. That is the most dangerous course of action. Are they likely to do it? Look, I'm not sure, but what I would say is they are increasingly preparing their military capabilities to do that. And they did have a military modernisation milestone to have the capability to do that by 2027. Now, some people have read into that means they intend to do that by 2027. I think that's a false reading of it, but certainly they intend to have the capability, and that is dangerous. Increasingly since 2022, we've seen China doing these massive joint, so Army, Navy, Air Force, Rocket Force exercises around Taiwan that very much look like rehearsals for a potential invasion. Whether they intend to do it or not, look, I don't know, but things are not trending in the right direction. And I think that in Australia, we need to remember that any military action against Taiwan is not just going to be something that happens in the vicinity of Taiwan. It's most likely a regional conflict, which means Australia is impacted and Australia is involved.
We really appreciate your analysis, as always, on these very uncertain times. Jen, thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
That was Australian security and defence expert Jennifer Parker. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Natarsha Belling. See you next time.